All right. All right, can one of our panelists confirm that you can see my screen? And I am just about to present. That is not the right thing that I wanted to click. Can you guys confirm that I am sharing my screen?
Yeah, we can see it.
So my name is Madison. I am the content creator and graphic designer for Misty West. I am also the organizer of Vancouver hardware meetups. I'd like to welcome you guys to our third online event. To give you a little bit of background about Vancouver hardware meetups, we are a forum for local hardware developers, product developers, engineers, makers, entrepreneurs, and funding angels to pull together minds from all corners of the hardware community in Vancouver and to help connect makers to funders. If you have any questions about our events, please feel free to reach out to me at my email, madison@mistywest.com. To give you a little bit of background about Misty West, we're a Vancouver-based engineering consultancy that exists to create novel technologies that enable a healthier planet. We specialize in intelligent connected devices. And yeah, we have a lot of emphasis on positive impact for the planet that our moderator Farheen will explain a little bit about for you after this, but we felt that covering this topic for our event really aligns with our values and our mission as a company. And before we start the event, I just want to let everybody know we do have a code of conduct. We're committed to providing a harassment-free experience for everyone at our events, regardless of gender, gender identity, expression, sexual orientation, disability, physical appearance, body size, race, age, or religion. So any comments in our live chat that are of a harassing nature will not be tolerated, and anyone violating these rules will be removed from the discussion. So today we are talking about the dark side of technology. I wanted to shed some light on some of the ethical implications that have been coming to light a lot recently on the new technologies that are being developed. I had actually been wanting to host a topic for the hardware meetups like this for a while. I really love Black Mirror, and one of my working titles that I had come up for this event ahead of time was called Robot Police Dogs and Killer Drones, but I was told to just kind of narrow it down. So we just called it the dark side of tech. Our panelists today, we have Andreas Putz. He's a computer scientist at Misty West. He's one of our tech leads. We have Mike Nasseri, an urban futurist, and Sarah Butterfield, who is an artist and co-founder of Dreams Unlimited Limited. They will introduce themselves in a moment when I am done with this introduction. Our moderator today is Farheen. She is a project manager here at Misty West. She's been with us now for about 2.5 years. And today's session, we're going to do about 10 minutes for the panelist introductions, followed by 40 minutes for a live discussion. And then the remainder of the session is an audience Q&A and just some outro slides. Here's a rough idea of the questions we're going to cover. It looks like in the live chat right now, you guys are already asking some of these. So some idea is what technologies are we developing now that may have significant unintended negative consequences? TikTok, a fun waste of time or an evil data mongerer? How we combat bias in AI and ML programming? And what are some technologies or systems that are being designed to help us avoid disaster? And I have a question for each of our panelists. When we have each of you introduce yourselves, I would like to know, what do you think is the biggest problem with technology right now? And that is it for my introduction. So yeah, if you guys are interested in learning more about Vancouver Hardware Meetup, you can follow Misty West online. You can join our meetup group at meetup.com, or you can check the hashtags on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. And that is it from me.
Okay.
So I'm going to stop presenting. And then I'm just going to step aside.
Okay.
I'll hand it to you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Madison. As Madison mentioned, my name is Farheen Taki. I'm a project manager at Misty West. My background is in medical devices and imaging. I feel really excited about projects that have high impact to people and planet, and that's why Misty West is a perfect place for me. It's right in our vision and mission. And today's topic is related to that, and therefore it's close to my heart. At Misty West, we talk about this quite a bit internally. And it's because we have an internal project veto process where any Westie can call for an ethics review if there is a project that they have concerns about, where they feel that it may have unethical implications, or it can cause negative impact or harm to people or our planet. This allows us to be selective about the projects that we work on. Answering the first question, what do you think is the biggest problem in technology right now? For me, it has to be how the technology can be used to create mass destruction in a short amount of time, and do it in a way that part of the world wouldn't either be aware of it or wouldn't care about it. So this is related to the technologies that are used in warfare, and also technologies that are used to spread information, manipulate our behavior and our thinking process. It's widening the divide that already exists in the society, and it's also making us less mindful, less connected to the physical world around us, and also less empathetic. So those are my thoughts on this topic. I'll move on to Mike. Mike, maybe you can introduce yourself and also answer this question next.
Yeah, hi, my name is Mike Nasseri. Found out about Misty West while in the tech industry a few years ago. Have since left the company Ava Technologies I helped found, and been working on other things, particularly to try to have more impact around carbon emissions. So I shared a link higher up in the chat for guatsi.ca, which is Arctic Indigenous Innovations, a project that is a research development center of excellence in the Arctic to test out technologies. So if you have technologies that need extreme climate testing or can benefit Arctic Indigenous communities, please reach out to me. There's a lot of big problems, and out of my list of AI ethics, finance, power, centralization, I think data sovereignty is really one of the biggest issues, where if we can address and have regular users achieve some level of data sovereignty, a lot of these other power issues, like the centralization of power of mega tech corps, and the revenue streams that increase that power disproportionately, will be solved. So yeah, data sovereignty is where I'll start.
Oh, I hear you.
I'll go. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Andreas, would you like to introduce yourself and I'll also answer this question, the same question? Andreas, we cannot hear you.
There is the unmute button. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm Andreas. I work at Misty West. I'm the resident computer scientist and mathematician, so I have a background in mathematical modeling, specifically of fluid dynamics. I worked in clean technology, specifically for hydrogen fuel cells for a while. And I'm now doing most of the software-related tasks at Misty West. So one of my key interests is machine learning and autonomous machines, specifically on edge, so on small compute devices, on the peripheral, on the internet, so small robots, imaging devices, computer vision devices, which have some sovereignty on the outride of the internet without having to go back to the cloud. And there is a lot of the issues which come in around privacy, trust, and what actually can you do locally without having to transfer all the private data and all the data back to a large storage and aggregation machine. So what do I think of the dark side of tech? I was thinking a lot about this question, and I came back to the conclusion the dark side of tech is a manifestation of the dark side of us. So it's not so much the tech I'm afraid of, it's us and our use of it, and how tech can accelerate some of our natural ways how we can make things worse. And to that, I think one of the big issues, or more subtle issues, is that interplay between things being transparent versus private, but also what amount of truth or reliability we can glean from the information which is available to us. We have access to a lot of information, but it's very, very difficult to now see which information is trustworthy in what context. And I can see that's getting a little bit out of balance. So how do you reconcile privacy, transparency, and trust?
Thank you, Andreas. Hi, Sarah. So please introduce yourself and also answer the question, like, what is our biggest problem in tech right now?
My name is Sarah Butterfield. I'm a local artist and teacher. I'm working on a couple of very cool projects at the moment. One is Dreams Unlimited, which is a kind of speakeasy, outside speakeasy in town. It is possibly one of the best nightclubs in town right now. It employs a lot of local artists and DJs. I'm also working with Misty West on a very cool, quite radical offline platform, which is just about to reach proof of concept. So we're very excited about that. I could talk more about it later if you're interested. But my worries, I don't know. I mean, you know, there must be some correlation between social media and populism. If you believe Trump, he says he couldn't exist without it. About 10 years ago, I was... Sorry. About 10 years ago, I started making a documentary with a group of teenagers to ask them what they thought were the problems with social media. And I quickly realized that it really depends what end of the telescope you're looking at the problem from. You know, my questions to them about the disappearance of civic duty, ideology, the erosion of privacy, the increase in distraction, the epidemic of loneliness, they kind of looked at me and they thought, well, we don't know, you know, what we're living now, and we're just going to engage and whatever. But what I do see in my 22-year-old son right now is that they're forming very, very cool urban tribes to protect each other and working together and collaborating and using this platform in very, very interesting and radical ways that I didn't have access to when I was their age. And so, you know, I think it's very easy to make despair convincing, and it's much harder to make hope possible. And you know, there are pros and cons in both directions. I think Trump is grotesque, but I also think that my son's generation are thinking about some very, very cool restructuring in the new normal, which has to do with redistribution in the economy, universal basic income, and they need the tools we have. And they're not so concerned about privacy issues. They think it's a given that their data is mined, but they are reorganizing in ways that changes their collective thinking about now and the world and people in it.
Thank you, Sarah. I think the points that you all touched on, we can elaborate more on the questions, the next set of questions that we've prepared. So I'll get into the first one, and anyone can answer this. What technologies we are developing now that may have significant unintended negative consequences in the next few decades? Would like to go first? Andres, do you want to go first?
Okay, just as a shot. I think there are two levels of technologies, like our ability to handle large and vast amounts of energy, transmit and manipulate it in any given form, weaponized or non-weaponized, is going up and going up, and it always is going up. but with that, the consequences, something goes wrong, even if we use them intentionally, has gone up. The way we as humans can impact the climate is unprecedented. The way we can shape our world is unprecedented. So with that comes a responsibility in deciding how we do that. On the entire different level of information, which has no physical weight at all, we are at a time where we can change software, implement and deploy software practically instantaneous. So we can iterate very, very fast, way faster than we can reflect. So we have to trust that whatever iteration happens is not doing anything bad until the reflection happens. And what you see at the moment, I think, is the fact that when you have time to reflect of what this has done, that we're not happy with what we have done, but then we have to roll things back, and rolling things back is always difficult, or go forward in a way to counteract what we have already done, which is also more complicated. I think those are my two meta instances of I think we have.
Yeah. Thanks, Andreas. Mike, you were also, I think, about to say something.
Yeah, in terms of things we will regret, I've already crossed the threshold in. Autonomous weapon systems are really scary, and not really just because of the performance. That's not what concerns me. It's the, previously all military tech pretty much was developed in military research silos, but now consumer tech can contribute to that. And when we look at the small, like UAV drone type suicide systems, those are incredibly cheap systems that could use like commercial navigation software to achieve what used to take a lot, like billions of dollars, and only a few governments would have the capability to have these at their disposal. So, the discussion we'll have about ethics fits into that. I've never heard about that Misty West kind of, you can pull the cord and stop the line if there's an ethics issue. I think that needs to be spread out to everything, because there's so many places where we're going really quickly in dangerous places, dangerous directions.
Yep. Very good points.
I think we're quite capable of falling in love with our own hype. And what worries me a lot is, who writes the algorithms, who's in control of them, and whether we can program for philanthropy, for example, the speed of change in that fascination. I think we're all becoming quite narcissistic at the moment. If you look at a lot of things that younger people are consuming, they're a mirror. They're reflecting an idea of self and an image which is sybaritic. And that worries me enormously, is the fascination of self, as things become tough, but the bigger issues of how we drive the machine and stay in touch with each other and remember civic duty and perhaps, reading a book or doing strange analog things, I think the epidemic of loneliness that is connected with this fusion is very worrying to me. And increasing poverty, it costs a lot of money to go outside. It's much, much easier to be fascinated by a screen than it is to go out. And that scares me a lot.
Yeah.
I think you, Mike, had a great point when I thought about this, about autonomous warfare. And to me, what is the extension of it is autonomous policing.
Yeah.
Like, if you look at warfare, one of the reasons wars stopped because it's uneconomical. And that was mostly driven to the loss of life is so unacceptable in your army that you had to stop because you run your population down. Now with autonomous drones and autonomous machines capable of doing this relatively cheaply, there might not be a driver to stop. And same thing with policing. police and police action laws change because the effort to enforce it sometimes is so out of proportion to what the rest of society wants that you eventually have to do this. We saw this with prohibition, with our approach to drugs, where not so much policy took a long time, but just the want to put the law into action through police is so unaffordable if you want to do something which is against the society's will, that you had to stop that. If you have robots doing that, you don't have that barrier.
Yeah, I just want to point out, luckily, that's one of the bigger sci-fi topics that has been addressed by, like, going back to Asimov, like the ethics around robots and androids. And this particular issue is an obsession of Neil Blomkamp, and there's two really great movies kind of, you know, putting these dangers right in your face, if you haven't seen them.
Yeah. So there are multiple very interesting points here. The one that I want to maybe ask more about is, there are a couple of them. The first one would be the fact that change is happening really fast, like Andreas, you said that. And in that speed, we don't reflect on what is being done until it's much too late. So what can be done to mitigate that, do you think, from the industry's side, within the industry?
I'm not so sure it's industry's problem, to be honest, because industry, in a market society, industry does what the market wants. The problem is how you want to control the market and how you get the feedback, and that's the critical thing. So you collect feedback from what people want, but what we personally want, but compared to what we as a mass of people want, are sometimes two very, very difficult things. And I think one problem is that with the decisions, our day-to-day decisions, we don't see how they align with our values. We don't see how we can make decisions which would reinforce our values. So without doing that, ordering a book from Amazon or from any online vendor, it doesn't make a difference to take the most convenient one. But the question is, okay, if I have an underlying principle, an underlying value, what are my easiest decisions which make this felt? And that's the same thing when you buy software, when you execute things. The other aspect of this as a user is a lot, because the internet is so fast, you can respond whilst you're still very emotional. We are very emotional beings, but in our day-to-day reactions, there are mechanisms in place which allow you to cool down before you act. And a lot of things I see on Twitter and other really fast-paced media, that you don't cool down before you act. That's sometimes good, but sometimes things roll away. And I think that roll away point is where there has to be a mechanism to slow things down and reflect a bit more.
So do you think, is it through education of the society more, spreading more awareness around this? What would be, and this is, I guess, a question to all of you.
I think part of it is, adoption. I think we're adapting to that, and perhaps that will take us in check, and we got run away because it's new, it's shiny, so we get carried away.
Yeah.
But at some point, I think we don't want to live in that permanent state of extreme emotion engagement, I guess. Unless we don't, I think that Sarah's point is there something in our brain which is changing, which makes us crave that?
Yeah, I have something to add, which is Andreas mentioned the market drive. And I don't know about you, but I don't really think there's any like purely free markets that we're dealing with in. These are somewhat manipulated, whether it's by like boundaries being created by regulation or not being created. And it's the same thing around incentive structures. Right now, the Misty West, the fact that you're allowed to kind of like stop the line and bring up this ethics issue is not an incentive in itself, but you don't have anything disincentivizing you from doing it. And I think just that thing is what's missing in a lot of companies, is where there's no, it's not so much that we have a lot of horrible incentives that lead to things like the 2008 crash probably multiple crashes coming soon in smaller scales. But it's like within companies, we don't have like proper incentives and disincentives that are a lot easier to impose than that macro like government scale. So leadership, I think, is a position where CEOs stepping up or executive teams stepping up and saying, like, if we're delivering AI systems, we're going to do an exercise where we bring in a third party to do like a red team, blue team exercise. And spend that extra money, which you're not necessarily being incentivized to do, and including through the fundraising mechanisms. Like, but these are really important long-term things, and I think overall that's one shift is like our markets incentivize all the short-termism. So that's why we don't even address this stuff, is because these are long-term considerations, and I think culturally the younger generations are shifting in that. Economics are shifting that way. So yeah, that's my thought.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Sarah, you described loneliness as an epidemic, and it's a sad reality of our world right now. What do you think can be done? Like, we are more attached to our devices than people around us. What do you think what can be done on that side from industry, from technology, and even from the government? Or like, what do you think? This is definitely is a major issue. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it goes hand in hand with the erosion of trust. And I think, the creation of public spaces and opening up public spaces that aren't private spaces for people to gather and exchange is very important. I think, people want lovely days. You could invent delivery systems that design lovely days for people where generations can cross, where people who've given up connecting can reconnect. And I think that's what my son's generation are trying to do right now. They realize there's been an erosion of trust, and they're tired of shopping. And they're trying in little incremental ways to create tribes, urban tribes that are really looking after each other and sharing their income across the board and making sure everyone's safe and included. And it's like, reinventing village life in a way. And we have to massively concentrate on that humanly. I would say.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah.
It is also said that Vancouver is one of the most lonely cities on the planet. There have been a lot of studies around this, about isolation here, and I find it fascinating. I'd really like to understand why that has been said. It's both one of the most livable cities on the planet, but it's also one of the emotionally coldest, considered to be one of the emotionally coldest. And I don't know, I think it has a lot to do with private property, actually, and laws and unimaginative thinking. But I think my son's generation think that's going to change, because they're going to blow it open. They may not win the top political debates, Populism is a tough challenge, but they will engage socially at lower levels, and like all pioneers, they'll be noticed.
Definitely someone who's moved to Vancouver 2 years ago. I can relate to your point about Vancouver's loneliness, and I'm not entirely sure why. Also, why it's there, but there is definitely. Sorry, you were saying something, Andreas?
Yeah, no, go ahead, but I want to chime in on that. And you're done.
Okay. But the positive side that you're describing, this youngsters and teenagers now finding their own way to connect, is a positive that I think is coming out of this whole in different technologies that we're dealing with in our life.
I think it's coming out of COVID.
Yeah,
actually.
That's right. Yeah.
When gathering, when you have to be so careful about gathering, you think about gathering. So, they are trying to figure out how you're going to break through this newer barrier that we're all facing is affecting everyone. And, universal basic income has suddenly become a talking point from COVID. You can see that governments can respond very quickly. And, the new normal, the structures of the new normal are going to be very different. It may take quite a battle. I think things aren't all roses, but it's on the mind of young people to harness communication tools they have and new structures. Yeah.
Thanks. Do you have anything to add, Andreas?
Yeah, I found that loneliness point about Vancouver interesting because in one way, I think the way Vancouver is built is why for a large city we do relatively well in the COVID epidemic because everything is so spaced out for a large city. But the counterpart is that kind of that community on a local level is not really there. Like I moved during COVID and it sounded wrong to just introduce myself to the neighbors during the last pandemic, so I still haven't done that. So I'm within my walking distance, I'm practically isolated. On the other hand, I have in the last year found a lot of people going to meetups, going hiking. I find that relatively easy, but you're right. The probability to find someone you like in a coffee shop versus to actively really go somewhere where your interests lie, or hiking or something like that, is relatively low. So if you want to find contact, you have to be really, really active to do that. It's relatively difficult for that to casually happen in Vancouver for some reason.
Before you move on to the next question, Mike, I wanted to go back to your point about autonomous weapons and how a lot of things that are right now being built in consumer space can be weaponized or used. What do you think? What steps should industry take to mitigate that? Like, how can you turn a drone that you buy off the shelf into a weapon, for example? Yeah.
Well, when it comes to the biggest company, DJI, I think they were always, within the interest of the Chinese economy. They've always been this kind of like, okay, they're a commercial company, but they're doing some weapons development as well. So first thing is don't start the project. There was, I forget the report, but some team developed some type of dogfighting combat AI system that outperformed a human in a simulation environment so highly that the team basically said, like, we should just stop this. But it was too late. The generals saw what the capability was and they wanted that. So the point is, like, something won't necessarily, first of all, you're incentivized to create that stupid technology because there's lots of money there and the consequences can be damned. That's kind of how we are today. But just because someone else might build a technology doesn't mean you need to build it first. In the commercial space, like, yes, militaries will be thinking about that in like a strategic sense, but the ability to keep that weapon system hidden from adversaries and therefore not press the race is also a really important thing. An example could be the stealth helicopter that we first found out about when it was used in the raid to kill Osama bin Laden. Because they kept that technology under wraps, there wasn't a parallel development trying to keep up in other countries. Don't build killer tech.
Okay, thanks a lot for all your answers. I'm going to move on to the next question, which I've seen some comments about as well. TikTok. It's a fun waste of time or an evil data monger who's making our already short attention span worse. What do you guys think?
Yes.
Yes. Yes to which one?
TikTok, if I could just jump in quickly, I've been using it for probably about a year now, and one of the very first things I saw was the potential security breach, and like even if the government of China is not having this data on their like accessible to them, there's people that share really intimate details. The two things that stood out was like I remember seeing a congressperson's kid doing TikToks inside of their house. It's got to be some kind of security breach. I saw videos of like an F-22 being refueled by a guy in the Air Force, and it's like probably shouldn't save that even if you're uploading it later. And so yeah, TikTok exposes all this information, and it's assigning us our own little private social credit score, which does include a dancing judgment, by the way. But otherwise, it's an incredibly powerful medium, more so than any of the others, in my opinion, in terms of providing opportunities for true education or true misinformation.
Okay, thank you. Any thoughts from Andreas or Sarah on the same topic?
Like many, new platforms, I think it's a mistake to call it either evil or frivolous. I think it can be both those things, but also it's a place for reading the zeitgeist. And friends I know, young friends of my son, they're doing these incredible mashups from TikTok, which are political, and they're a language that's quite surreal. It's sort of uncoupled from truth or making sense, but they have a kind of structure to them of incredibly playful and acerbic and political. And I think it's a mistake to kind of, it's very hard for older generations to understand what's going on in the invention of new languages as they become available. Yes, there are monsters out there and the market is disgusting, but, people have always done interesting things with new technologies, printing presses, onwards, Books even were a technology once. Mm-hmm. So, queer things come out of it, and it can be disruptive and in a very interesting way. I think targeting markets and data breaches and privacy is a huge, huge problem for many, many people. But they know that, and they're doing interesting digging inside TikTok with new media, new comments.
I think I agree with both of you that I think what we know, the question we asked of TikTok, we have asked of every single social media platform which is out there. We have asked it of the internet to begin with. We have asked it of the TV. We've asked it of radio. Before that, we've asked it whether books do the same or not. And I'm pretty sure we asked this question about the first branch and the first rock we picked up. I'm pretty sure when the first rock was picked up, a bunch of concerned parents were looking, what's that rock technology doing to our children? So I think it's a problem which will always be with us, or not necessarily a problem, but a fact of how we distribute and react to information, how we express ourselves. And for that, I have not gotten into TikTok yet, but perhaps will after this. But I don't have a problem with it. The privacy breach is another aspect to this. I think that sharing to massively many people, this is going to increase until we can instantly reach everyone. But the other aspect of this is, I think this is the one thing we have to be aware with. I think there are studies out there which say if you read a lot, that changes the way your brain reacts and your brain builds itself. So we have changed the way our brain networks itself a couple of times in human history, and there were certain leaps associated with that. And there are some studies which show, hey, reading a lot has something to do with the way we can concentrate, we can be productive in a certain way of working. So the question is, if we move away from the book and wherever we move next, what does this to our perceptive system? What does this to the physical side of our brain to adapt to the way of how we work and how we interact?
Mm-hmm.
And then we just have to be aware of this, and we come to the conclusion, I don't like where this is taking me. I don't have to use it. I can go back and read my book, right? So this is the choice we can make. As long as we know.
I think every generation gets it wrong about the next one.
Mm-hmm.
And, the more important task at hand is to improve education, improve the access to education, and talk about these things, and mix generations so that they can reflect together. When I talked at the beginning about looking at two ends of the telescope, my son doesn't understand me because I'm at the other end of the telescope, but he's kind of hearing me, and he wants to hear me because you don't understand change when you're standing on top of it. And the job, we should make education free for everyone, and then they can ask intelligent questions about TikTok. At the moment, they may or may not be passive, passive absorbers of this platform, but some are, some aren't, and the world's becoming more visually driven. But you've got to talk. They want to talk and understand the world, and we don't. Schools are appalling at talking about these things.
If I can just follow up on that.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that makes TikTok more questionable, and this is in response to some of the questions in the chat too, is that unlike Twitter and Facebook, which are visual means but more text heavy, like TikTok is this video thing. And so the way it hits our midriff is different. Like the image flows directly into our brain. We're not having to reinterpret it or be slowed down. And that's one of its powerful things, not just in creating like the dopamine, but you combine that with it being the simplest interface ever. Normally with Facebook, you have to decide, do I scroll, do I click on that? TikTok is just like, you swipe up if you don't like this, or you're done, and you will do everything else. So it's the physiology that it facilitates is a next level above. And the question around why the data aspect is evil is, on other social media platforms, I know how they make money because they're advertising things that I might actually buy. On TikTok, there's nothing that they showed me that I have a chance of buying, so I frankly don't know how they're making revenue, other than pure exploitation of the data in questionable ways.
And I also feel similarly about TikTok. It's the addictive aspect of it that sometimes worries me, especially we see kids with their devices pretty early on now. 3-4-year-olds have iPads, iPhones, and what does that addiction to the devices and the information that is being displayed does to them? Having watched Social Dilemma recently, that's on top of my mind. We are that constant stream of information that's tailored for you to keep you engaged and keep you engaged with the devices and stay on the app. That is the part that worries me. Any thoughts on that? Or
do you think it's possible to drown in information?
Yes.
How do you make the choice if you, well, first of all, you don't know how to understand the answer to the questions you ask, but also there's just too much of it. You can kind of get paralyzed. How do you make a choice between something at that speed?
Well,
how do you do it?
Information is information if it's not noise, right? So if you have so much information that you can't discern anything, it's indistinguishable from noise. So the question is, how do you not let this happen. Well, you don't have a choice because information is coming up. I cannot decide how much information there is in the world, which comes down to the problem. All I can decide is how I filter the small stream to think what the information is that I want. And I think what social media and all media today do is they create this filter for you without you noticing that the filter is being created.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So to the extent that I only get information I want, which makes me happy because I don't want to read unhappy information, but not information I truly want to get. So I stand in my own way in trying to get the information I truly want. And one of the questions is, okay, how can you bias or how can you actually influence those filter systems?
Well, I think we need to have a societal level discussion on the value of advertising, marketing, what should and shouldn't be allowed, because it has been the most toxic cultural aspect throughout my life. And it is the root of a lot of these problems. Like, why do we have shitty incentives on websites? Advertising. Why do we have these questions about TikTok? Because ultimately they're basing that on advertising. And I think the antitrust lawsuits that may be slapped on the big 3 or 4 will hopefully address kind of like, what they should and shouldn't be doing. Like, we should not have video advertising on websites when that's like 90% of the data that needs to be transmitted. That should be illegal in my opinion. It's no more effective than just having that static image and a truly efficient internet.
What you say about advertising is interesting because I think that ties into the fast feedback loop. Like, the way you can tailor advertising based on information is unprecedented. But the lot of question is what metric you actually use. And this is the problem with metrics and their relationship to reality, right? Sure, I have easy measurables, but what is it that I really measure? And a lot of the advertising measures, does my sponsored link get me more traffic compared to any other traffic which goes on my website? But if I want to buy something on Amazon, I look on Google first, and the first link on Google is the Amazon link. But I would have bought this on Amazon anyway. But the feedback the systems get is, that link worked, hence my advertising worked, hence I put more effort into this particular line of advertisement, which might be completely inefficient. So we have a feedback system which is amplifying the wrong thing. And I think this is when we say a lot of advertisement is so abstruse, yet somehow the feedback in the companies is that, hey, this works, this is great, we will do more of that. So the question is, instead of legislating away what behavior change or what other mechanism I could execute would make this go away.
I would like to move on to the next question, which is actually somewhat related to this topic. And this is specifically for you to answer, Andreas, initially, and then we can move on to other. And the reason why it is specifically for you is because we've talked about this in past, and you had some opinions about it. So the question is that the studies are finding that AI or ML tends to show bias in regards to race, gender, language, religion, etc. How do we combat it? How do we combat bias?
This is an interesting question because coming from a mathematician's point of view, or perhaps a data scientist, I have already a problem with the word bias because it's too ambiguous. There is bias, what do you mean by that? But there is another bias you talk about in statistics. And most of the time when we talk on a bias from an ML perspective, there is none. Because my algorithm is doing precisely what I wanted to do. You gave me data, I statistically analyzed the data, my prediction does give me the properties of the data back. Perfect, that's what you asked me to do. So in a way, I want to rephrase that why bias in AI is bad for society into why is unfairness and envy in the society bad news for AI? Because analytical bias is easy to fight in an ML algorithm. And when I hear people talk, oh, there is bias in the algorithm, most of the time they look at the underlying training data and you see, hey, your training data is skewed. Right? In this case, there is no bias in the algorithm, it's in the underlying data you presented. And if you would have done your homework as a data scientist, you're supposed to do exploratory data analysis. So look at the statistics, look at the means, look at the variance, do the basics we have done since the 1800s. And this would immediately tell you that whatever you do, your prediction algorithm is going to be biased because your incoming was biased. So don't claim this magic bias term if we have been lazy. And I think a lot of the bias, what we see in deployment, is due to laziness. We did not, as data scientists, we did not do our homework correctly. We didn't analyze the incoming. The other problem is more diverse. The other one is when we train. So I'm talking specifically about machine learning. AI is a completely different topic. But a lot of machine learning is based on training data. So we have data which is labeled. And we sample this data from reality. Now, there are two aspects to this. We could have drawn a bad sample. And we could draw this bad sample because we are a bad scientist, because we had a bad day, we selected an unrepresentative sample. But we built this entire prediction engine on this bad sample. Okay, this should not happen. Statistics will tell you when you have done that. The more fundamental problem you have, and this is related to, for example, 2 months ago, there was one of the biggest image data sets on the internet withdrawn, and I think it was some tiny ML data set. And it was withdrawn because it had labels which just were horrendous, and it was just a data set which contained a lot of controversial issues. But the way the data set was generated was it was a random crawl sample from the internet, random images crawled, and their captions analyzed. They have drawn a representative sample of the underlying reality. And the underlying reality is that there is bias and there are things in the world we don't like. But they have based the algorithm based on that. So now you're asking a machine, given that you have a sample which is already unfair and contains envious and malicious data, magically we want you to do better than we. Mm-hmm. And we want you to predict or infer a non-skewed version of what we gave you. And that's an interesting aspect. So given the underlying data, given the underlying reality which you sample, how do you produce a result which is fair and not envious? And that is a fundamental issue. So how do you generate a fair prediction? And that requires you to figure out what fair is. And it requires you to figure out what envy-free is. Fairness is doable. Envy-free is a completely different problem. But then you need a measure for fairness. And as a society, we have to come up with what we consider fair or unfair. And then you can perhaps implement that. But it's that implementation step which is mostly missing.
Yeah. Well, surely algorithms will be coded for bias because society is biased. You know, it's like, why are there so few women involved in technology or at the top of the game in technology? Who's writing the algorithms? It's mostly white men, and billionaires. So, I mean, of course there's going to be bias in there.
And perhaps not so much bias, but reinforcing, right? If you have a bias, it reinforces the bias you already have.
But it's always been that way.
Yeah, correct. And it's not surprising, right? So there are these job recommendation engines where they come to the conclusion, well, our machine learning job recommendation engine only gives us male white candidates. Mm-hmm. But then the underlying question is, if you actually look who we hired mostly male white candidates. Yes, the ML has a problem, but the underlying already had a problem.
Yeah,
right?
Where is that problem?
I like the discussion coming up because it shows us the flaw in the underlying.
Yeah,
it's like the Catholic Church used to be, right? It's a group. There's a bias built in to how things are written and understood. You've got to restructure the community of people you engage.
Yeah.
There is a question, Andreas, from the audience. What do you mean by envy-free?
Okay. So in mathematical decisions theory, there are two things. And the classical thing is how you divide a cake, a linear cake amongst many people. And there are two concepts of that. One of them is that you think you got what you should have gotten. That's, in my terms, what fairness is. You got what I got what I think I should have gotten. Envy is when I look at the other people and say, I still got what I should have gotten, but the other people got more than I think they should have gotten. And that is a problem. So you might be able to find a fair distribution algorithm, but there could still be envy in the system. And combating the envy is a fundamentally difficult problem. There is a solution for the linear cake, but there are not many solutions for a non-linear cake.
John Rawls.
Yeah, round cake. There's a round cake solution, but
Yeah.
I just want to mention, to wrap this up, or to add some context, many of you have watched The Social Dilemma. We were talking about it earlier, and then I saw some people bring it up. The woman, Cathy O'Neill, who is featured in that film, wrote a book, Weapons of Mass Destruction. I highly recommend it. And one of the things that really stands out to me is that we didn't need technology to have these biases in our systems, but the way when we've digitized them and kind of created this network effect, new problems arise. So she gives the example where, say 80 years ago in the United States, if you wanted to get a mortgage, you'd go to the banker and you'd have to talk to them and shake their hands. And if you were Black, hope that they weren't racist. But if they were racist, you still had a chance to at least appeal to their humanity. Whereas with the modern context, there's absolutely no transparency as to why you're being rejected. So the equivalent example of like someone who's Black in America probably doesn't live in one of the better zip codes, and that zip code may be what determines them paying a low rate that the people with good credit scores get, or paying the really high rate, which is going to keep them down. So in the past, they had some type of recourse and like ability to see the impediment, but now that completely disappears. And this was actually a big key to leading up to the creation of the subprime mortgage meltdown 12 years ago, where the people being sold these like horrible loans didn't understand or necessarily even have the access to what was going to happen when that variable rate skyrocketed.
Yeah. So I think it's related. So my next question would be related to all of this. So, or the general theme here. And this is something that, Andreas, you had mentioned that it's not dark side of tech, it's dark side of humanity. So why is it that humanity always tends to show its ugliest side through technology? And what can we do to prepare more? And this is not just for us, open to everyone.
I don't necessarily think that always is true if we go back in history. If we even go back to recent European history, like in my history class, there was not so far away 40 years of war, followed by 30 years of war, followed by other wars, followed by the First World War, followed by the Second World War. Like the world was a way more warring place than I think it is now. Despite the fact that there's still a lot going on, but at least on that scale, we have found other alternatives. We founded the United Nations. We have strengthened the United Nations. We have weakened the United Nations again. But at least at some point, we seem to have an agreement what universal human rights are. So there was some effort in this, and there was some successes. The way the European Union was created was on an economic basis, but also on a philosophical basis. And then the philosophical basis went away, and it's just an economical basis now. And then you see that a unity based on an economical basis alone does not cohere well together. You need something else on top of that. And the question is finding what's on top of that. And that's very difficult to do as a society as a whole if you're in the humdrum of your daily life. And if I look at myself, what are my guiding principles right now? If we had to write them down, I'd probably have problems writing them down concisely. How could I then act on that? And how can I communicate this out? And how can I find consensus around that? And how do we find a measure of, yes, I have impact on how this shapes the world? And I have not found an answer to that myself.
I think we're capable of great evil. We're also capable of being very kind. And it is a function of how much we trust each other. And when you trust people, you can be inclusive. At the moment, we live in a very broken, fragmented world where we don't know where trust lies. And I think it is the duty of schools and education to absolutely reopen that conversation with young people and help them understand it's a political issue. It's not just something that older people are telling them is a problem. It actually shapes their world. And I think there are, as I said at the beginning, urban tribes and young people who are really working hard on the idea of inclusion and sharing a circular economy, even though they're surrounded by the exact opposite. But they know also those old white men, they're going to disappear one day, you know. So, but education, we've got to get schooling back into the 21st century. So it is a creative hub for understanding collaboration and circularity and trust. Very critical.
What you say with schooling is interesting, specifically the last part, getting schooling and education into the 21st century, because I agree with you that it's not there. And I'm a little afraid that it's easy to say, oh, school should do all of this. We are a society, we should teach each other. Like it's easy to say, oh, school should do all of this. It's not my problem, but it is my problem, right? So I think everyone has a responsibility to share and teach their experiences. And if you just say, oh, everything is done in school, like
No, but I mean, I think we need to respect our elders, you know, and young people are very solipsistic. They hung out a lot of the time. They hung out. They rise to their own lowest common denominator because they hang out with peers. But you know, it's so important to have social spaces that encourage cross-generational learning and mixing. Because there's a lot to learn from, you know. The baby boomers may be really annoying to young generations, and you know, I think secretly they think we should sort of step aside, and that COVID may be helping that. But I actually think that's a very unwise tactic because there's a lot to learn.
But it's also it's a good thing to say respect your elders, but it's a two-way street, right? The amount of things I learn from the interns at the group is tremendous. Like.
Oh, absolutely.
It gave me insight in things I never thought I would gain insight in. So I think the respect has to go both ways. It can't go one way. Oh,
absolutely. I learn a ton of shit from my 22-year-old that I never knew was there, and it's fantastic. And I have hope, actually. I'm not pessimistic. And I think it's really important that we find hope and we're not pessimistic. We have to find a pathway of optimism because they've got to live in a very changed world, and COVID's going to cost them their entire generation. And it's a real thing now. And it'll shake down through their lives, you know. So, yes, it's a two-way, it's a mirror. It's always a mirror.
Yeah, I just want to expand on that intergenerational thing. Like how we've, you know, what Misty West does should be presented to other companies around like the the ethics audits for projects. But one thing I've thought is necessary is like intergenerational co-mentoring. And if you're in charge of a company, like, make it happen. It doesn't have to be more than like a half-hour call every couple of weeks. But if you're also figuring out who not to keep around in the older generation, the people who don't want to do that are the ones that you don't really want to be further making your culture toxic, I would suggest. Yeah, ethics lunch and learns. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah, I hope more companies can adopt it.
I think you should have a young person on your tech
board.
Mm-hmm.
And on your board, actually. I think it would be brilliant.
Yeah. So we talked about things that people can do amongst each other, create these spaces, have intergenerational learning. How about, what role does government play in all of this? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Government? What do you mean by government?
Regulations, or should there be an oversight from that point?
Well, I think government does play a role in like facilitating education, but they're doing it. They're creating more factory workers for a factory economy that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So, you know, they definitely need to be doing something, but first they need the culture change. And going back to TikTok and YouTube, even though the algorithms can take you down rabbit holes, this is how people are learning today. And it's not just the kids anymore. Like my dad, who is 78, you know, is now using YouTube as his learning venue. So, yeah, I think overlapping what's been built and not integrated into the education system is one thing governments can do, because they're trying to teach yesterday's lessons using yesterday's methods when today's lessons are like already being accessed by the students.
I think we need to restructure what we understand as government. You know, I think we need to create citizens' assemblies, so across generations, so you actually get a real reading of what it means to be alive. You know, I think there's this sort of very separated culture of government, and it tends to come through very privileged educational channels, and it's sort of self-fulfilling, and it's always behind the times. And I think the only way you can get correctives put in place is by democratizing the level of debate at a level of citizenry and civic engagement.
The interesting with government is also their hierarchies, right? So we have, I guess, theoretically the UN, we have constructs like the European Union, then we have countries, we have BC, Alberta, we have cities, we have smaller communes. So there is this multi-level system of hierarchy where the question is this still the right distribution, where you say what role does a provincial, what role does a federal government play in the world? Like if we say we have a united world, what decisions really would I want them to make, which a local government couldn't make?
Well,
so why?
Trump would say it plays absolutely no role at all. You know, social media is his platform and his kind of government. It's like,
yeah, the thing is, he's not necessarily wrong with that. Like, what's wrong is what he does with it. But the question is, how do you... So there are countries like Switzerland has a relatively democratic process. Like, it's very easy to have direct democracy and direct decisions made based on few people wanting it. And then there's a direct vote of the entire population, and that iteration process is relatively fast. The problem with that is that it impedes a consistency also needs. So how do you balance the timescales, and how do you balance locality? So you want a system which is flexible but not too flexible, and local but perhaps not too, you have to act locally enough that you feel an impact, but not locally enough that the global is badly affected. So how do you balance time and space in decisions?
I have some answers to point towards. An author, Parag Khanna, one of my personal favorites, has a book called Connectography. And so he would reframe kind of what you presented differently, whereas like the previous century with economies of scale and the type of industrialization we went through favored centralization. So whether it was an authoritarian communist government, authoritarian fascist, or a democratic system, they were all centralizing power at the federal level. Now we see kind of disadvantages of doing that. And so not like, you could also tie in Jeremy Rifkin's work with in his books and his work with the European Union, where he's suggesting the framework to actually achieve carbon negative and carbon neutral goals is the federal government not making decisions. The federal government's job is to basically aggregate the money, allocate it, and trust the people close to the problem at the local and regional levels to actually decide how to spend the money. So there was a book, Connectography, Arissa, and as well as the Green New Deal by Jeremy Rifkin describes what's already happening in China and European Union. Yeah, two fantastic authors.
We will be opening it up to questions from audience very soon. There is one question, though, that I'm getting pinged about, and that we didn't touch on, one topic that we didn't touch on, and that's health, electronics, health record breaches. Should we be concerned about security breaches of these types of data companies? Is the question.
Yes.
So an example is 23andMe.
Yes, but I think that to me just points to a much bigger question, which is around like data sovereignty and the future of central bank cryptocurrencies. So I'll try to reframe it. So our health data is less fungible than the cash, the digital cash that we are going to hold. So if we fix one problem for the cash, we can have data sovereignty that protects that other data somehow, I think. So, but I just want to point out, with all the central banks talking about digital currencies, we need to start thinking about the issues that we saw at the fall of the Soviet Union, where we're basically going to see governments giving away tiny shares of companies like the Soviet Union did, and people trying to scam those. So like, this question to me is like, we need a secure data wallet that people are educated on so that they're not like leveraging it or getting scammed as, and so that we actually have a place that you can own your data as opposed to 23andMe being the repository. Yeah, that was just quick thoughts.
Maybe paradoxically, if you made people healthier and happier by, say, a universal basic income, maybe, the whole question of what to steal from someone else changes fundamentally. The data
Absolutely.
is no longer as interesting. It's the same, you know, in Finland, most prisons are closed because they stopped decriminalizing criminality. They decided that people needed help rather than locking them up and throwing away the key. So, you know, I think there are huge health issues around the way we consume technology and the way it feeds into us. And we can do a lot to make people and the consumption of technology healthier, and then the data is less interesting for pariahs who want to sell you things like drugs for a, you know, it's kind of endless loop of, there's paradoxes in it. You know, who's judging the judges and who's feeding on what? But I think fundamentally, you know, you could take an awful lot of anxiety away from people by giving them basic provisions, you know. For example.
Yeah, and I want to push, like let's start calling it a citizen dividend, which is maybe a more authentic representation than the freedom dividend or universal basic income.
Yeah, I mean, the happiness index is a real index of GDP now. I think Bhutan uses it to calculate its economic wealth. You know, so happiness as a social, societal issue is a thing we need to weigh, and it changes the way we live in the world and feel about it and each other and the climate. You know, if you're depressed or you're on drugs or life's fucking horrible, you're not going to care really. And maybe you buy more chairs or something. You know, it's like, I don't know. There's a very interesting psychology around happiness and awareness of others.
Well, I think a lot of like, I see crises of imagination in everything we do, including my own life. Like, our problem is not lack of imagination; we just don't use it or necessarily apply it. And
because we can't afford to.
Typically, yes, and that really like the reason that so many things are shitty in the way that we're discussing is because we haven't had incentives to think in the long term. It's been all very short term thinking. If we think of like the any of these issues, like the incentives are do this shitty thing, make money in the short term, damn the long term consequences. And that's not inherently how humans think.
Yeah.
But our systems have kind of gotten away from us in encouraging things that we know better.
It's like planting a tree. You know, you plant a tree and you will never see it to the end of its life. This short-termism that we live under is analogous. You know.
I just wanted to announce to the audience that you can post questions if you want now.
There are two interesting corollaries to what you just said. One of them is going back to the health data. It's like one of the problems with health data is the hold it has over you once it has leaked.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and then no matter that fact, the underlying question is, why does it have such a hold? And if it does, is this something that the society want? Do we want? How do we want to structure costs? So now, if it has leaked, it might impact your employment, it might impact your insurance costs, it might impact you in a very, very consequential, immediate way.
Mm-hmm.
And so the underlying question there is that what we want to do with this data? So if you do a DNA test, is that, okay, adjust your insurance fee based on this, adjust your employment? Is that what we want to do with this data? I think if that's what we want to do with this data, we are in trouble, no matter whether this data is in a secure wallet or not, because people want to get on it. So again, it's a decision, what do we want to do with it? What's the purpose? And how do we deal with information we have that the society benefits without having to penalize an individually more than a certain amount? There is always a trade-off, right? There is always, you can't have everything for free, right? So there's always a cost associated with something, but how do you trade this off?
Data is worth more than the price of oil now. And we have to figure out, you know, what empowers it and figure out how it's traded and what gives it so much value. It's like money, it's an abstraction. But there are societal changes we can make where you disempower aspects of data and also you control the people who control data, you know, like the Zuckerbergs of the world. But it's a big issue, huge issue. But yeah, privacy.
Well, and data is like, it's the way you framed it. Yes, the total value is now larger than the value of oil reserves and the industry, but the comparison has a lot of holes in it where data is not the new oil. Data is a finite resource that is difficult to extract and refine and get to a useful state, whereas data is more like sunlight. There's more of it than we're going to be able to use for decades. And it's pretty easy to just like throw some panels and capture some electrons. Like if you have the ability to process some of your data, you do it because there's going to be value. But again, I think we're incentivized to start with the wrong thing because it has short-term returns compared to you know, starting somewhere else with that data set.
But the expressions, you know, closing of the American mind or amusing ourselves to death, these all come from data issues. You know, what sort of feedback loop we're in. And it's very powerful way, or propaganda or disinformation. It's a very powerful way of controlling people.
Mm.
It's not a fossil fuel, no.
I think we can talk on this topic for hours. we are sort of running out of time, unfortunately. So at this point, we'll be closing out this webinar, and Madison will be guiding us through it.
Thanks, Farheen. I apologize to anybody that's in the live chat who maybe had a question or topic that didn't get covered, but there's just so much that we want to touch on. But after I present slides, I'd like to give each of the panelists some who end on a high note, basically. So I would just like each of you maybe to take like 1 or 2 minutes to say something positive that is being done in technology, and we can end this with a little bit of hope. So I'm just gonna start sharing again. So yeah, I'd like to thank everybody for attending. I've been getting lots of messages from my colleagues about their excitement for this webinar, and I've seen more engagement in the live chat than I've ever seen. So this is clearly something that we're all really passionate about. I know that I am. I want to thank our panelists again. This has been a really great discussion, and I feel like we're all coming from various different expertises and backgrounds, but there's still so much unifying in this conversation when it comes to ethics and the philosophical aspects of the world that we're living in. And for anybody that is still watching, if you want to suggest a topic for a future hardware meetup, if you'd like to be a speaker for one or would like to sponsor an event, sponsoring is more related to when we used to do these in person, but you can reach out to me, Madison Hope Reed. You can find me on LinkedIn, or you can send an email to me at madison@mistywest.com. And that is it. So I'm just going to stop presenting here, and we'll thank each of our panelists for speaking and start to close this off. So who would like to, how we'll get from my top right here, we'll get Mike.
Start with something positive. Yeah, it's a hypothetical, but I guess one thing that stands out is if Biden is to win the presidency and the White House, then we are likely to see Andrew Yang in a cabinet position. And that's not just important because of his whole thing around the freedom dividend, but it is maybe the first credible person at that cabinet level in the developed world that has just a glimpse of the understanding of not just technology, but some of the issues here. Like, his technology company was an education company, study prep. So even though he'll be probably the youngest cabinet members, in a sense, we'll have some like tech grown-ups at that level for the first time, and that excites me.
I can go next. I really, Sarah, your point about urban tribes really resonated with me. And I think social media, if used as a force for good, can really facilitate that. And I am hopeful that it will be that force of good when people come together through those media to do something towards a cause, a good cause.
I mean, I think connectivity, you can't get lost anymore. And there's no excuse for not talking and sharing information, however you do it, whether that's just making sure, someone can get home or how they are, or, the cost of actually feeling about your friends or your immediate company is so easy now. And it is so amazing that this kind of lovely music they have together now of just taking care and making sure people are safe. I didn't have that growing up. It was arduous and getting in touch with other people. And I think it's marvelous. It's all interconnected and in together. It's cool. Very cool.
Yeah, positive sides from me. So one of them is I had the chance to mentor a hackathon just before the COVID close down happened. But through that and through the interns at Misty West, I had the chance to really interact with a lot of young people coming out of university, and I have seen a lot of. I was impressed by the generation which is currently in university and has been coming up for a couple of years. That they're well-rounded, they have traveled, they have seen aspects of the world. They're not only focused on their studies; they have a connection to the local tribe. That I agree with Sarah, that having the chance to build a local tribe in space, but also now have to build one mental with people you like, not restricted by space, having the other option to do both is pretty exciting. On the technical side, I think there's some changes coming with, edge devices are going to become more intelligent, so it's in our hands to make them do what we want them to do. So we have a scalpel in our hands where we can shape things, so it's up to us to shape it.
Yeah, and if I could just amend my answer, perhaps more exciting than what I said is that the green energy revolution and the associated resilient economies or anti-fragile economies are starting to gain some traction. I think we are, take a watch over the next month. Oil took a massive hit this year. It's not going to recover from that. It's got a long way to go down to zero. But in getting rid of this $100 trillion industry, we are reducing $500 trillion of risk and gaining 26 million net jobs. Like, the benefits of this are not just exciting from like, hey, we're going to survive. It's actually the foundation of an economy that, has these aspects that we've been reaching for and suggesting we need.
Yeah. Cool.
Thanks, guys. This was really great. Maybe we can do a follow-up to this, like not a year from now in Halloween, but maybe we can keep this conversation going, because I think that everybody has a lot of feelings on it. So I want to thank you again for joining and setting aside the time to do this today.
Thank you. It's fun.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Wherever you are.
Cheers, chat.
Take care.
Bye.